She fixed my tie with steady hands, then pressed it to her lips as if sealing a promise. From that moment on, every lesson felt like it was about us, and neither of us could pretend it wasn't. The day ended the way so many others did, slowly, almost reluctantly, with the sun spilling gold through the tall classroom windows. The desks were empty now, the air holding that faint paper dust smell that only appears when the room has gone quiet. I stayed behind, gathering my notes into a pile that I didn't really need to organize, pretending to be busy so I could stay just a little longer. She was still at the board, wiping away the last of the day's chalk in long, measured strokes. The soft squeak of the eraser was the only sound, and for some reason it felt strangely intimate, like this was a side of her few people ever saw. Without the noise of 30 students between us, she seemed different. Lighter. When she turned back to the room, her gaze swept over the rows of desks until it landed on me. She smiled, small but warm, like a quiet acknowledgement that I was still there. "You don't have to stay and help," she said, her voice soft in the near-empty room. I shrugged, stuffing my pen into my bag. "I don't mind. It's peaceful here after everyone leaves." She chuckled faintly, setting the eraser on the desk. "Peaceful is one word for it. Lonely might be another." I wasn't sure how to answer that, so I just nodded, my heart strangely loud in my ears. When she crossed the room toward me, I noticed things I never had before: the faint click of her heels on the linoleum, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she walked, the soft rustle of her sleeve. She stopped beside my desk and handed me the book I'd left behind earlier. "You forgot this," she said. When I reached for it, her fingers brushed against mine. Just a brief touch, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day without meaning anything, but here, in this quiet room, it felt like it lasted a second too long. As I slid the book into my bag, I saw her glance down at me, at my tie, slightly loose from the end of the day. Her hand moved before I even realized what she was doing. "Your tie's crooked," she murmured. She smoothed it with quick, efficient fingers, tugging it straight. It was such a simple, practical gesture, but I could feel the faint pressure of her knuckles against my chest through the fabric of my shirt. And then, just as quickly, she stepped back. "Better," she said, smiling again, but something about it felt softer. I walked home that evening thinking about the way her hand had lingered near my collar, the way the sunlight had caught the edge of her hair. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that anyone else would have noticed. But for me, that small moment changed the way the whole room felt. The next time I stayed after school, it wasn't an accident. I told myself I needed extra help with the upcoming exam, but if I was honest, I just wanted to see her like that again, quiet, unguarded, without the usual distance that existed between teacher and student when the room was full. When I stepped into the classroom, she was sitting at her desk, glasses perched low on her nose as she graded papers. The soft scratch of her pen and the rhythmic flipping of pages made the space feel warm and lived in. She looked up as soon as she heard my footsteps. "You came back," she said, her lips curving into a smile that seemed to soften her whole face. "Yeah. I thought I could use some review time," I replied, holding up my notebook as though to justify being there. She nodded, pushing aside the papers and patting the desk next to her. "All right. Sit. Let's see what you've been working on." I sat down, close enough that the faint scent of her perfume, something floral but not too sweet, drifted toward me. The edge of her sleeve brushed against my arm as she reached for my notes, and the contact sent a quiet shiver up my skin. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and was just better at hiding it. We went over problem after problem, her voice low and patient. I realized she was tired, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle slump of her shoulders, in the way she paused between explanations as though gathering herself. It was the first time I saw her not just as my teacher but as a person who had lived a whole day before this, with her own worries waiting for her when she left. At one point, she leaned over to underline something on my paper, her hair falling forward until it brushed against my sleeve. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder. The tip of her pen tapped against the page, but I barely heard what she was saying. I was too aware of how close she was, how quiet the room had become. When she finished explaining, she didn't move away immediately. She stayed there for a moment, glancing down at my work, her face just inches from mine. Then she seemed to catch herself and lean back, clearing her throat softly. "You're doing better than you think," she said. Something about the way she said it, almost like she was reassuring herself as well as me, stayed with me. As I packed up to leave, she touched my forearm lightly, stopping me just for a second. "Thanks for staying late. It's nice, having company." Her hand slipped away almost immediately, but my arm still felt warm where her fingers had rested. Walking out into the cool evening air, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted, not in a way that could be explained, but in the way you just know. The rain had been falling since morning, soft and steady, tapping against the windows like a quiet metronome. By the end of the day, the halls were nearly empty, most students eager to escape into the wet gray outside. I stayed behind again, offering to help her organize the stack of books for next week's lesson. The room felt smaller than usual, warmer somehow with the rain muffling the world outside. She stood on a small step stool, passing books down to me one by one, our conversation casual, about the weather, about how fast the semester was going. Each time our fingers brushed as I took a book, the contact sent a tiny ripple through me, but I tried to keep my face neutral. When we finished, she hopped lightly down from the stool, wiping her hands on the sides of her skirt as though the books had left a trace of dust. "You didn't have to stay," she said, glancing at the clock. "I didn't mind," I said, and it was true. I could have stayed there all night just for moments like this. The quiet, the nearness, the feeling that we were the last two people in the world. She looked at me for a long moment, then stepped closer, tilting her head as though studying something. "Your tie," she said softly, a faint crease appearing between her brows. "You never keep this straight, do you?" Before I could answer, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the hollow of my throat as she slid them under the knot of my tie, tugging it loose just enough to smooth it back into place. Her touch was unhurried, careful, almost tender, and for those few seconds I didn't dare move or breathe. When she was satisfied, she held the knot lightly between her fingers. Then, without warning, she brought it to her lips. It wasn't a kiss exactly, more like she was testing the fabric against her mouth, pressing it there gently as if it were a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to say out loud. The sound of rain filled the silence, and I felt my pulse drum hard in my chest. She let go of the tie, smoothing it flat against my shirt with the palm of her hand before stepping back. Her expression was unreadable for a moment, and then she smiled, small, almost shy, and said, "There. Perfect." I couldn't think of anything to say. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy with something I didn't quite understand yet. "Thank you for staying late," she added, her voice barely above a whisper now. I nodded, unable to do more. That night, lying awake, I replayed the moment again and again. Her fingers on my collar, the soft press of the tie against her lips, the look in her eyes afterward. Nothing about it was loud or dramatic. And yet something inside me had shifted completely, as though she had just drawn an invisible line between us, one that I couldn't stop thinking about crossing. The next few days felt strangely quiet. She still taught the lessons as clearly as ever, still greeted the class with the same calm, collected tone, but there was something different now, something I couldn't name but could feel. She rarely looked my way, and when she did, it was quick, almost careful, as though she was afraid of letting her gaze linger too long. At first I thought I had imagined it, the moment with the tie, the press of fabric against her lips. Maybe I had read too much into it. But the memory was too sharp, too vivid, and the sudden space between us only made it sharper. One afternoon, I lingered by the doorway as the rest of the class filed out, hoping she might say something. She was standing by her desk, stacking papers into neat piles, her expression unreadable. "Need something?" she asked without looking up. Her voice was polite, professional. Too professional. "No," I said quickly, but my chest felt tight as I walked away. That night, I found myself staring at my tie hanging over the chair in my room. It looked so ordinary, just a strip of navy fabric, and yet I could almost feel the warmth of her fingers on it, the faint pressure when she pressed it to her lips. The memory had become a secret I couldn't share with anyone, not even my closest friends. The following morning, I tried to act normal, but it felt like we were circling each other in silence. She kept her distance, her words to me clipped and brief. It was as though the room itself had grown colder. Still, there were cracks in her careful mask. I noticed them in the way she hesitated before handing me my graded paper, and the way her eyes softened for half a second before she turned away. During one lesson, I caught her staring out the window when she should have been writing on the board. Rain streaked the glass outside, just like the day of the time moment, and her expression looked far away, wistful, almost sad. When she noticed me watching, she blinked quickly and returned to the lesson, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe she was feeling the same storm I was. Each day that passed without talking about it made the memory heavier, like something building quietly between us. I started staying after class again, not with an excuse this time, just sitting there longer than I needed to, waiting for the moment she might look at me the way she had before. If she noticed, she didn't say anything. But sometimes, when the room was quiet enough, I caught the faintest sigh escape her, the kind that sounded like she was holding something back. And that was when I knew, whatever had happened between us that rainy afternoon had changed her too. By the end of the week, the silence between us had grown unbearable. It wasn't just awkward, it was heavy, like a closed door I couldn't stop staring at. That Friday, when the bell rang and everyone else filed out, I didn't move. I stayed in my seat, heart pounding, waiting until the last of the voices faded down the hallway. She was gathering her things at the desk, flipping papers into a folder with precise movements, but I could tell by the way her shoulders were set that she knew I was still there. Finally, she looked up. "You're staying late again," she said, her voice calm but not unkind. I swallowed, suddenly nervous. "Can I ask you something?" She hesitated, then nodded and gestured to the desk in front of her. "All right. Sit." I moved closer, perching on the edge of the desk like she'd asked, my hands gripping the edge to steady myself. She leaned back against her chair, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. For a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet tick of the wall clock filled the room. "Did I do something to upset you?" I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "You've been different." Her eyes softened immediately, and she exhaled a slow breath. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You didn't upset me." "Then why?" I stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound childish. "Why does it feel like you're avoiding me?" Her gaze dropped to her clasped hands, and for a long moment she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, almost hesitant. "Because I'm trying to be careful," she said. "I realized the other day that I enjoy talking to you, maybe more than I should. And that scared me." The honesty in her words hit me harder than I expected. "I thought maybe I imagined." I started, then stopped, feeling my chest tighten. "I thought maybe that moment didn't mean anything to you." She lifted her eyes to meet mine, and there was no hesitation there now. "It did," she said simply. The air between us felt charged, heavier and warmer all at once. I could see the faint flush rising to her cheeks, the way her fingers twisted together in her lap. "I don't know what this is," she admitted softly. "I just know I don't want to hurt you. Or me." I nodded slowly, my heart pounding but strangely steady. "I don't want that either. But I also don't want to pretend nothing's happening." Something in her expression broke then, not sadness, but relief. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the desk near mine. "Then maybe we stop pretending," she said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't dramatic. But it felt like the first honest step we'd taken together. After that conversation, everything felt different. Not easier exactly. There was still a carefulness in the way we moved around each other, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant, like something waiting to bloom. The following week, I stayed after class again. The room was dimmer than usual, the late afternoon light turning everything a soft amber. She was standing by the window, looking out at the courtyard where the wind stirred fallen leaves into little spirals. When I entered, she turned her head slightly, as if she had been waiting for me. "Everyone's gone," she said softly, her voice almost blending with the hush of the room. I nodded, dropping my bag by a desk. "I figured." For a moment neither of us moved. Then I crossed the room until I was standing a few feet away from her. The light framed her face, catching the faint gold in her hair. She looked at me, really looked, and I could feel the question in her eyes, unspoken, but there. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her quietly. She didn't ask which part. She just nodded, as if she had been thinking about it too. "I don't want to make things harder for you," I said. "But I also don't want to keep pretending." Her lips parted slightly, like she was about to speak, but then she didn't. Instead, she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, almost nervous gesture I had never seen from her before. "I don't want to pretend either," she said finally. Her voice was softer now, like a secret. Something in my chest loosened at that, like a knot untying. Slowly, I extended my hand. For a moment she just stared at it, her brows drawing together in hesitation. Then she placed her hand in mine. Her fingers were warm, her palm smooth. She didn't pull away. We stood like that for a moment, not speaking, not moving, just holding on. The room felt so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the soft rhythm of our breathing. Then she stepped closer, until there was hardly a foot of space between us. I could see the faint crease at the corner of her mouth, the rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled. "This is dangerous," she murmured, her thumb brushing over my knuckles almost unconsciously. "Yeah," I said. "But it feels right." Her eyes searched mine for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for, she must have found it. She gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but it felt like the world shifted with it. When she finally let go of my hand, she didn't step away. Instead, she reached up and adjusted my tie with a faint smile, her fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary. It was the last day before break, and the classroom was glowing with the soft gold of late afternoon. The week had been strangely calm, no more tense silences, no more careful avoiding. Whatever had shifted between us had settled into something quieter, something we didn't have to speak aloud to understand. I stayed behind again, and this time she didn't even ask why. She was already waiting, leaning against the edge of her desk as if this had become our unspoken ritual. "You made it through the term," she said, a teasing note in her voice. "Barely," I said, smiling. Her own smile was softer, more personal than the one she gave in class. "You've done well," she added. "In more ways than one." I moved closer, and this time there was no hesitation. The space between us felt like it belonged to both of us now. "You still can't keep this straight," she said lightly, reaching for my tie. Her fingers worked carefully, tugging it into place with that same patient motion I'd come to recognize. But when she was done, she didn't immediately let go. Instead, she rested her hand flat against my chest, right over my heart. Her palm was warm through the fabric, and I felt my pulse jump under her touch. "Better," she murmured, but she didn't step back. I placed my hand gently over hers, holding it there. For a moment, we just stood like that, the room utterly still except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. "You know," I said quietly, "when you pressed this tie to your lips that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I still can't." Her expression softened, and there was something unguarded in her eyes, relief, maybe, or acceptance. "I couldn't stop thinking about it either," she admitted. "That's why I pulled away." I was afraid of what it meant. "And now?" I asked. She looked around the empty room, as though checking one last time that the world outside couldn't hear us. Then she stepped closer, so close I could feel the faint brush of her shoulder against my arm. "No," she said. "I think it means we stop running from it." We sat down side by side on the front desk, hands still linked. The late sun stretched our shadows across the floor. We didn't talk about the future, not yet. We just sat there, shoulders touching, sharing a quiet so comfortable it almost felt like a promise. When it was finally time to leave, she walked me to the door. At the threshold, she reached up and smoothed my collar one last time, smiling in that soft, steady way that made my chest ache. "See you after the break," she said. And somehow, those simple words felt like the beginning of something, not just the end of a term, but the start of whatever we were going to be.